Hello and welcome to this video. Today I'm going to make a tiny house inside a resin cast. I'm starting out by marking the parts of the house I need out of some thicker cardboard. So I mark out all the side walls that I need for the house and for an extra tower, and then I'm carefully cutting them out with my X-Acto knife. After they're cut out, I use some UV resin to hold the parts together, and I scored the parts of the tower where I wanted to fold it over, because that makes it way easier to get straight folds. For the sides of the house, I use some tape to help me hold the parts together, and I always make sure to cure the UV resin properly before applying the next part. So after comparing the tower to the house size, I realized that it was way too high, so I trimmed it up with an X-Acto knife to the right size I wanted to be. I connect the tower to the house with some more UV resin, and then I cut out some roof shapes out of some a bit thinner cardboard that would be easier to fold. And I made this off camera because it took me multiple tries to get this right. To smooth out the sides of the house, I'm just using some hole filler, the standard stuff that you can get at your local like Home Depot and stuff, and just fill in the tiny gaps where I folded the cardboard, and just cover it in general to give it a slightly nicer texture. I had a really hard time to decide what I wanted to make the rooftops out of, but then a friend gave me the idea to just use some higher grit sandpapers that would look kind of like, you know, the tarp roofs or something like that. And I thought this was a great idea because I think this looks quite nice with this house. And then it was time for me to paint. So I'm using my modeling paints here, since they are liquidy enough to lay really flat on this miniature. And I'm using my brown tones to paint on kind of wooden beams, since I want this to be a countryside house. I paint the windows on with some black paint, and then I use some of my brown paint to paint on beams all around the windows and all around the tower. I'm also adding a brown door, and I'm making a really light wash with some black and brown paint that I just paint on, kind of like a weathering effect, where water would kind of drip down and dirt would accumulate on the white paint of the house. I decided that the black windows looked way too dark and so I used some watered down blue paint to make the windows look like they are reflective and have more light in them. To make the base, I'm mixing some PVA glue with some really fine sand, and this gives kind of a modeling paste that you can shape a bit. And since this is a farmhouse, I'm adding some tiny crops, for which I'm just using some dried tiny flowers. And this process took a very long time. The flowers are so tiny, just to place them right was really, really hard. After the base was dried, which took some time for me because my glue is having a really long drying time, I used just some more of my modeling paints and I apply a dark green as the base of the grass, and then for the grass I'm doing a really light dry brush of light green to make it look more like grassy and dimensional. And I'm also adding some really light brown for the crop area to make it look more like dirt, and I'm adding a tiny little path. To finish off this piece, I'm just mixing some tiny stones with some UV resin, and I'm adding them to kind of line the path. After curing that, I'm adding a protective layer of UV resin all around the piece so that I can protect all of my paint and the crops and have them stay in place while the two-part resin is hardening. And now that I've finished my building, I can finally start with my two-part resin. And I'm using Sophie and Toffee's 3-in-1 resin. And I'm just using a tiny bit of pigments for some amount of the resin to fill up the mold in the top to get some nice swirly effect. And I'm starting with some white, and then I'm adding the blue in, and then I carefully top it off with the clear resin so only the top top of the mold, or like the top of the piece, will have some of the swirls of white and blue to make a really nice sky and cloud effect. I hot glued the building to a stick that I'm then carefully placing inside the resin before letting it cure. Now this went horribly wrong. I don't have any footage since it was really stressful, but the hot glue somehow didn't hold the piece up. So the piece fell into the resin and displaced a lot of resin, and I could still fix it since it was in the kind of gel state, but sadly most of the color got pushed up. So that's why I didn't record more of this process, but in the end I just topped it off with some clear resin and added some more of this sand and glue mixture, and here you can see my final piece. I'm really sad that this pour didn't turn out that much, but luckily you still can see the building through some of the clear parts. I just would have hoped that the foggy part would have maybe reached to like the mostly the top of the roof of the tower, and so you could have seen the building and the surrounding area way better. But I still had really a lot of fun with this project. And I also really liked this Sophie and Toffee mold, which came in their pixie box. It has a nice effect for when you put in some miniatures. Now, if I have some time in the future, I will definitely try something like this again. And maybe I will share my results if I ever try it again also in a video. Anyways, I had so much fun with this project despite the sad mishap, and I hope this gives you some ideas what to do when you have this kind of mold, and shows you that you really don't need much to make some tiny miniatures. And I hope you had fun watching this video and that you have a great day. Bye!